Tonight on the All Kinds of Weather Forecast, we return to bring you a December update of all the news going on in Gator Nation. We've got coaching hires, transfer portal, high school recruiting, and a preview of early signing day. This is the All Kinds of Weather Forecast. And welcome in to another episode of the All Kinds Weather Forecast. Happy holidays to all out there in Gator Nation listening. Today is December 17th, 2023. We are almost a week away from Christmas. And happy Hanukkah to all of our fellow Jewish listeners out there who just celebrated Hanukkah this past week. We're getting down to the end of the year, but that does not mean news in Gator Nation has stopped. If anything, it has only picked up over the last couple of weeks since we last came to you. And that was when we had Shelton on from High Top Sports as a kind of a state of emergency podcast, recapping the season and where we are at this point, coming off a 5-7 season and a loss to the Florida State Seminoles, who did not make the playoff. We're going to go ahead and remind everybody out there once again, the first Power 5 team never to make the college football playoff. Good luck against the Georgia Bulldogs in the Orange Bowl later this month. Before we do all that, want to make sure we shout out our merch store in allkindsweather.com/merch. There is no better time than to buy your friends or family some Christmas gifts, some Gator merch out there, as Neil is sporting his hat up there. And you can see he's pulling some other things here on the camera. Also, that lovely water or beer cup mug, whatever you want to drink in there. But go to allkindsweather.com/merch. Buy your family members, gift them some great gifts this holiday season, and make sure if you are listening and like our show and the content, make sure to go ahead and hit that like button down below, subscribe, leave a comment on what you think how the Gators have done thus far in the transfer portal and the high school recruiting ranks. And if you're listening on audio format, please rate and review the show. Leave us a 5-star review. It helps us bring great Gator content to all of Gator Nation. So, Neil, it's been a little while since we've last talked. I think it's almost been about 2 weeks at this point since our last show with Shelton. A lot has happened then. And I think we kind of, we work hard on this show. We love doing what we do. You've continued to put out some great articles and we've continued to bring news kind of on the social media handles. But I think we wanted to let the news sort of drop before we did another one of these shows. And since then, we've had some big things happen. Obviously, the schedule release, which we're going to get to first in our analysis portion. We finally hired a DB coach, still no defensive line coach. Will Harris is the hire there. We'll get into that. We've had 17 guys transfer out of the Florida Gators football program since the fall. We now, as of tonight, have our first transfer portal recruit and commit. We'll talk about that. And we've got early signing day where we've had several of our players visiting our school as well as other schools, and we have brought in a couple of high school prospects that we are hoping make the decision to come play at the University of Florida. So, Neil, I just want to get a sense kind of where your head is at right now, December 17th, with where we are as a football program. Obviously, I don't really think it's mostly been positive, but tonight we're here to bring kind of a constructive, critical analysis of where the Gators need some help, need to work on, but also highlight at least some of the things that they have done well.
I mean, I can't say I'm very happy. I wouldn't. I think that the way that we both said during the season that there's a happy medium, there's a middle ground between be patient, letting Billy do his thing versus fire him now, destroy the entire administration, although that's a separate thing, but destroy the entire staff and we needed to rebuild that all over again. There's a middle ground. There's a happy medium that needs to be met with that. I think now I am in between where that happy medium was and fire him and start over and just wrecking ball the whole thing. Because let's face it, I'm sure we'll talk about this more both later tonight and in future shows, but just to set the stage, trusting the process last year, like in the offseason between 2022 and 2023, resulted in an even worse 2023 season than the 2022 season was, which in turn was also not acceptable. 6-7 losing season. So I don't know what you want me to do. If you're talking about trying to stay objective and realistic and logical while also not being overly negative. Like there's a few different fine lines I think we have to walk here, but the short version of it, I guess the teaser, the preview of what's to come is that there's not a lot right now to be happy about, because you just went 5-7 after going 6-6. And now we just lost our best player to the transfer portal, Trevor Etienne. And one of our better defensive players in Prince Allen went to another SEC school that we're going to be playing in 2023. So, I mean, now you can nitpick, say, well, it's more important to have a great offensive line than a great running back. Running backs are a dime a dozen. Princely couldn't set the edge. He had his moments of not great stuff. The Lou Last Stadium comment didn't sit well. A lot of fans, it's like, okay, fine. But you're just stacking a lot of negatives on top of each other. And it's the direction right now isn't looking very good.
Yeah, it feels a lot like one step forward, six steps back with this football program. And Napier, we've talked about it, how he just seems to lack a sense of urgency when the fan base right now is wondering when things are going to turn around in its favor, and we're going to start stacking lots of wins and actually hold the momentum, because that's been the theme of his tenure thus far. Is whenever a good thing happens, he's not able to stack it with more great things and build the momentum. We talk, back in the first season, he was 6-4 going into the last 2 games of the season, proceeds to lose 3 games in a row. This summer, he has a fantastic recruiting haul, and then proceeds to follow it up with a 5-7 season, and is now having to fight tooth and nail to hold together even a top 10 recruiting class, as we'll talk about later tonight. So it just seems like Billy just doesn't seem to have that sense of urgency. I'm sure that and this is where I fall. A lot of fans think he might be just mailing it in. He's getting ready to collect that $25 million buyout next year if he's fired. I don't believe that for a second. I think this is a guy that truly is trying to fight for his job, fight for this program. But, he might be stubborn. I think he might be a little bit stubborn in the belief in his plan, his
Just pause
process.
real quick. Have we heard that before? I feel like we've heard that before.
We have heard that, and that seems to be a common theme that gets coaches fired at the University of Florida, unfortunately. But to the response that he's mailing it in, I don't believe that's the case. I do think he is trying. It's just we need to see what that plan is, and if what he is doing behind the scenes as he's quote unquote moving in silence, as some of the more positive fans out there might say, we're going to have to start seeing some results of that very, very soon. But before we get to all the news and whether or not Billy Napier is making the right moves in order to improve, let's talk about the schedule he's going to be facing next year. This past week, the Gators found out the entirety of their schedule for the 2024 season. Neil, we knew a lot of these dates and teams going into the evening. You correctly predicted it in the last podcast, how you said we were going to have 2 bye weeks. We, in fact, do have 2 bye weeks, almost 1 month apart. And the Florida Gators will be taking on according to S&P, the hardest schedule in 2024. That is according to ESPN, S&P, which is a metric that rates the FPI, all the power rankings, and obviously that's a lot of big thing that Dustin loves to get into here. So this is, this is the top schedule in the country. And as many Gator fans will look at it, the last 5 opponents are against top 13 teams currently in the college football playoff. If we had a 12-team playoff right now, there's a chance all 5 could be in the playoff right now, which is wild to think. But they do open with 7 opponents, 6 of which did not finish the 2023 season in the top 25. Tennessee, the lone team, which of course they actually defeated this past season at home in Gainesville. So, Neil, we talked about how the Gators needed to stack wins in the 2023 season. Looking at this schedule, once again, I think that's going to be a theme next year when we break it down even more detail as we get closer to the dates. Florida's going to have to stack wins if they are going to get 7, 8, maybe 9 wins next year, which is sort of that area where Billy Napier is going to have to get to if he has any hope of hanging on for 2025. And Just a couple of things that just stood out to me. We put this out on the All Kinds of Weather blog, Instagram page, as well as our Twitter page. And Neil did write a more detailed article out there. So please go to allkindsweather.com and read that breakdown. But 10 of the 12 opponents on Florida's schedule made a bowl game. Florida, though, only leaves the state 3 times the entire season. They go to Mississippi State in the first month. They go to Austin, Texas in November, and they also travel to Tennessee in mid-October. So 3 times. The rest of those games are at least in the state of Florida, which is nice. They do have 2 bye weeks, which Neil mentioned in the last podcast. As I mentioned earlier, there is no 2023 ranked opponent until mid-October, and the last 5 opponents finished in the top 13 or better in the college football playoff. So that sets the stage for it. What was your initial reaction, Neil, when you saw this schedule come out?
Well, I mean, first thing I want to reiterate is yes, it's a tough schedule. Of course it is. You're in the SEC. I have no pity. I have no sympathy for, well, you can't get too mad at Billy if you only go 6-6 or 5-7 because the schedule is so tough. My response to that is almost robotic. You should have beaten Arkansas last year, should have beaten Vandy 2 years ago or last year, whatever, in 2022. You should not have given up a 4th and 17, and you should not have given up 700 yards of total offense against LSU. If your program looked, or just gotten bodied by Kentucky in the trenches,
And beat a backup quarterback for FSU.
or had 2 guys run out on the field with the same jersey number in 2023 against Utah. But that's just putting a pin in something that we'll come back to later. But this felt like a good time to mention that I don't want to hear issues about the schedule when all those other issues are in place. But as for the schedule itself, first thought is starting 3-0 is a non-negotiable. You must start 3-0. That's Miami, that's Samford, that's Texas A&M. All 3 of those teams will A, have a new quarterback, B, simply weren't that good in 2023, and C, all have to come to the Swamp. You got to protect your home field. You can't lose any of those games. You can't go 2-1. You just can't have it. Billy Napier needs to be 3-0 if he wants to come back in 2025. And the reason why is because we said the same thing about the 2023 team. You got to stack wins. So if you're going to be one that says that I'm being too demanding, well, here's my question. And if you're watching this on YouTube, put this in the comments, because I'm genuinely serious when I ask this. This is not rhetorical. I want a real answer to this. If you're going to order me to have more lenience and patience with Napier and Florida and say that 2-1 is acceptable, like if you lose to Miami or Texas A&M, I'm assuming we won't lose to Samford, even though we came close the last time we played them. I'm assuming that we won't lose both of those first 2 games. I think 1 and 2, we all agree it's an abject disaster. But okay, you're 2-1 with 9 games remaining. Find me 5 more wins. Go 5-4 in those last 9 games, because we agree, Chris, that 7-5 is the floor that we on this show will tolerate. And I think most Gator fans would probably agree with that too. At a minimum, 7 wins is needed. So Chris, you get the first shot at answering this as the host. Florida's 2-1. We agree Napier needs 7 wins. 6-6 won't do it. So with a loss in those first 3 games, find me 5 more wins. Where do they come from?
It'd be really difficult to find it getting those last 5. I mean, if you look at the last 5 games, I would say the only game really that I would potentially say Florida has a shot in is Florida State. And that the reason I say that is because they literally, their roster's getting gutted. They're not returning anybody from the 13-0 team they have this year. So maybe 1. Kentucky would be 2. UCF would be 3. I would say Mississippi State is 4, which leaves you have to then go get a win up in Knoxville.
Well, you're not including Central Florida. So Central Florida would be 1. I would give you that.
No, I did say, yeah. So I said Central Florida,
okay.
Florida State, and that's on the road at Florida State.
Yeah.
Kentucky at home, who a team you haven't beaten now in 3 tries.
Okay.
Mississippi State, so that gets you to 4.
Yeah.
And then Tennessee on the road.
That's not going to be easy.
Not easy. So, and then of course we're basically assuming we lose to Georgia, we lose at Texas, who's returning Quinn Ewers, we lose to LSU, who we haven't beaten now in 6 years going into this game.
Yeah.
And then Ole Miss, who is basically dominating the transfer portal. So it's going to be difficult. I agree. I think that your analysis is spot on. If we go 2-1, it's going to be very difficult to find 5 more wins.
So I agree. I'm glad that you explained that, not me, because I'm the one that gets the negative rap on social media. So I'm glad that you stepped in and took that baton from me. But back to the original point. I like to look at the schedule in segments. I went through the first segment just now. Said Florida has to go 3-0. That's non-negotiable. He loses any of those 3 games, he's not fired on the spot, but you lose again before Georgia and you go 5-2 into Jacksonville, and he's a dead man walking, because we know the losses are going to start piling up after that, like they just did this past season.
Deja vu. Deja vu all over
again. So 5-2. Oh, well, they're 5-2. That's not bad. Yeah, well, it's going to look a lot different 5 weeks later. In the loss column, not so much in the win column. Anyway, got to go 3-0 in the first 3, all in the swamp, all against new quarterbacks. Even Samford has a new quarterback. So got to win those first 3. The next 4, you've got to go 3-1. So that's at Mississippi State and then a bye. You're home for Central Florida. You're at Tennessee, and then you're home for Kentucky. Now, ideally, you don't lose to Central Florida. However, if you do lose that game and you trade it in for road wins at Tennessee and at Mississippi State, and you right the ship against Kentucky and you put an end to that little problem, that's 3 SEC wins. And I think most fans in this fan base would be very irritated that we lost to Central Florida. They would not like having to deal with their fans, but I think that they would, at the end of the day, whether they want to admit it publicly or not, they would take that trade-off of winning 3 SEC games for 1 non-conference game.
Especially if you beat A&M too, right? Because then you'd be 4-0 in SEC play.
Right. So it gives you, and like a conference record has a lot to do with bowl matchups too. So obviously a non-conference loss to Central Florida doesn't make anyone feel good, but it would help us in terms of getting to a more prestigious bowl game. Although I guess that doesn't really matter anymore either, with all the opt-outs that are happening in bowls now. The Orange Bowl, which was supposed to be a battle royale of 2 snubs of Georgia and FSU, is just becoming a joke with everyone. Trey Benson today saying he's not playing. So, but okay, beside the point, 3 SEC wins. Great. So that's why I say 3-1 in some permutation in those 4. Obviously, again, the most likely loss in there feels like at Tennessee. Kentucky has had our number last 3 years. And actually, if anything, that may just be the universe resetting itself after we beat them 31 straight times. But so maybe that's a loss because they beat us 3 in a row. Or maybe in our first road test of the year, we fall flat and we're just not ready for it. And we lose at Mississippi State because, we clearly weren't ready for the road environment at Utah and that little ass stadium. So, I don't know, maybe the first road test of the year is what does us in. Any one of those in isolation is acceptable. Can't lose more than 1. So now 6-1 heading into Georgia. Here's what I'll also say. I know everyone calls me a Debbie Downer and a negative Gator. Here's a bullet point against you. I think Florida gets one of those last 5. I don't think they lose 5 in a row.
I actually agree with that.
I don't think they lose 5 in a row 2 years in a row. I just think that's such a statistical anomaly.
And if he does, then he's fired. There's not even an argument there. He's definitely fired at that point.
Unless he's 7-0 going into it. 7-5 is the floor. Because again, that's a 2-game jump. That will mean that you beat Miami, you beat Texas A&M, you beat Tennessee. Maybe if all 5 are blowouts, maybe.
Yeah, I think the problem though, and this is a larger issue, is that there's more problems beneath the surface if you start 7-0 than lose 5 games in a row.
Right.
There's a lot of problems internally, even out of the control of the coaching staff. I'll say that. I think that Florida, if they start somehow 7-0, which when you look at this schedule, Neil, it's not actually crazy to say it. If you threw any of the 5 opponents into the first 7 games, and somebody says Florida can go 7-0 before Georgia, then I would say they're a little bit crazy. But you look at all 7 of those games, every single one of them is truly winnable.
At Tennessee is going to be very difficult.
But
that's a very good system at Heupel runs.
Right. But if you're going to make the argument that Kentucky's had our number, and that's why Kentucky has a shot to beat us, then you have to make the same exact argument when going on the road to Tennessee, whereas Tennessee has only beaten Florida 1 time in the last, 2 times in the last 20 years in Knoxville.
Yeah, but they won the
statistically
last
speaking,
one, and they won the only one with the two current coaching staffs that are going to be going at it on that sideline, on those sidelines.
fair enough. But I mean, at the end of the day, that's still Florida has had Tennessee's number historically speaking, and they did once again last year. And Tennessee probably wishes they would have had that one back because Tennessee clearly played a much better season than Florida did.
But that game was in the swamp, and this one is not.
True. No, I
Point
agree.
being, 6-1 going into Georgia is tolerable. So
I agree.
if you're going to lose to Tennessee on the road, fair enough. If you're going to lose another game that you probably shouldn't, like if you're going to lose to Mississippi State, or if you lose to Texas A&M at home, or God forbid you lose to Miami at home, it's not game over. You can win all the other games up and going into Jacksonville, but you go. I mean, 5-2 heading into Jacksonville, and he's a dead man walking, because then you go, Georgia, then you go at Texas. That's a loss. Then you come home for LSU, which that game has been Casey ruled. I mean, LSU owns us far more dramatically than Kentucky does. It's a lot more in just a few years. Ole Miss owned the transfer portal. And this year, oh, by the way, a top 10 team. They're in the New Year's Six. And FSU on the road, that's a rivalry game. Yeah, their roster is getting destroyed, but it's not going to be easy by any means.
I think best case out of the last five, it's 2-3. I think LSU, and the reason I'll say LSU, they're losing Jaden Daniels. They are losing some guys to the NFL. Their recruiting class this year is actually, as of this point, not ahead of Florida's. They haven't been as aggressive in the portal outside of the Texas A&M safety that they got that Florida was trending for at one point. I think eventually the rules, like you said, of Kentucky, when they lost 31 straight to Florida, the laws of the universe finally come back to normal. I think, and that's a game where those programs aren't that far apart. Eventually, at home, some magic in the swamp is finally going to go Florida's way, where the rivalry has gone, predominantly LSU's way since 2018. I think that's one Florida can get. And then Florida State, for the reasons I mentioned earlier, is that they're basically the roster situation flips. This coming year, Florida is going to be retaining a lot of their starters. A lot of the production comes back this year, whereas Florida State loses Jordan Travis, loses Trey Benson, loses Jared Verse, loses a lot of guys that have been leaders of that team that had got them to that 13-0 point on the cusp of a playoff berth. It's not going to be the same. And 2 years ago, Florida, with a Florida State team that was the same team that went 13-0 this year, took them down to the wire and only lost by 7 on the road in Tallahassee. It's not a place that Florida can't go in and get a victory. So I would say best case scenario 2-3. So if you somehow find a way to go 6-1 and then go 2-3 to end the season, 8-4, great. I mean, that's a great season for Florida.
I think that's a Pollyanna view, though. That's asking for a lot.
I mean, but that's not, that's to me, that's the ceiling. Okay. That's what I think is the ceiling, is if Florida somehow they do the permutation of what you're talking about, 3-0 to start the season, then they go 3-1 in those next 4 games, and then they go 2-3 in the last 5, 8-4. You go into that bowl game with some momentum, you get that 9th win. Napier then has momentum going into year 4. I mean, I think there's no doubt he keeps his job at that point. And then DJ Lagway starts the next year. And then I think that's what saves him at this point. But anything less than that, if it's 7-5, depending on how it looks, that I think is up for debate.
Yeah, I mean, I think 6-6, he gets fired. If there's some crippling injury situation, and like I'm talking Mertz, I'm talking Montrell Johnson, I'm talking Andy Jean, Eugene Wilson, and Shamar James, and then like 4 more guys on defense. They all go down in the first month of the year, and he goes 6-6. Yeah, okay, fine. He'll probably survive that. Anything short of that, no. 5-7 or worse, he's definitely fine. I don't care what it looks like. I don't care how close the games are or what the injury situation is. 5-7 and he's done for. 7-5, I think it's a real conversation. I think he will be back for another year at 7-5. I think that the validity to I've seen enough, fire him, is fairly strong at that point. But I think that's ultimately going to be the losing side of that debate. I think 8-4, and most people will say, okay, let's give him another couple years now with what looks to be a tremendous talent from at least from his high school tapes from Texas high school ball and DJ Lagway. Let's just see what this looks like. But yeah, I mean, 7-5, he is what he needs to do just to really feel safe. Because like if he goes 6-6 next year, the schedule is not really any easier in 2025. We don't know the SEC opponents yet, but I mean, we're going to have to go to Miami, which is more of a neutral site game than anything, but we still play FSU. We're going to play Georgia. You know, you're going to draw some tough teams in the SEC because of course you will, because you're in the SEC. So it's not going to get a ton easier. And I think at that point, it would just be delaying the inevitable. So 7-5 is what he needs to do to really feel safe about his job long term.
Yeah, no, I agree. I definitely agree. And, we'll see as things pick up here in the portal with how we finish with high school recruiting. I think the next, I would say 8 months are going to have a lot, how it's going to really gauge the temperature of how we feel going into August next year. There's going to be some moments here, how we finish with the portal, how we finish with early signing day and the February signing day, how spring practice looks, how the guys gel in the offseason. What are the coaching changes that still remain to be made? Because we know that we've only made two. I think a lot of people believe there are more to be made. The reason they haven't been made yet is because we're in the middle of recruiting. You don't want to mess up the staff too much before signing day. And also the guys that you're looking to hire probably right now are either in the NFL or currently in playoff coaching staffs where they have yet to be made known to people, at least publicly speaking. So we'll have to see, but I think that was a good breakdown early on of the 2024 schedule. We're going to get more into it into next year as the year goes on, but that is the first look at it. And of course, I think it is fun to always kind of do these little reveals and see what lies ahead. All right. So now let's get into some news that's been going on. So everybody remembers Corey Raymond was fired after the Florida State game. Caught a lot of people's attention. Obviously, Corey Raymond, known for his recruiting ability and putting guys in the NFL at LSU. He was probably one of the biggest hires that Coach Napier made when he left Louisiana to come to University of Florida. So who did he replace him with? Will Harris, the assistant secondaries coach for the LA Chargers. But before he was in the NFL, was a defensive coordinator for one season for Georgia Southern, and before that, a defensive backs coach at the University of Washington for 4 years. He played his college football for Pete Carroll between 2006 and 2009, so certainly comes from a strong pedigree in the college ranks on the Pac-12 side of things. So it has those West Coast ties. His resume is pretty good though when you look at it, Neil. 7 NFL draft picks in 4 years. And you broke that down in your article at allkinesweather.com, which we invite everybody to go on and read about if they have not yet. He had a top 20 red zone defense while he was the coordinator for Georgia Southern in 2022, something that Florida struggled with this past year. He had the fewest passing touchdowns given up in the Pac-12 from 2018 to 2021 while he was the defensive backs coach. So he comes with a solid resume of putting guys in the NFL as well as coaching up some solid defenses and schemes. The secondary was a major deficiency for Florida. We still don't know if Jason Marshall decides to go pro. We still don't know if they are going to be bringing in some other portal additions or if other guys will be changing. But we do have some young defensive backs in that secondary. Bryce Thornton, Jordan Castell, who's recently made some freshman All-American and All-Conference lists. So, he did have a solid freshman season, certainly took his lumps as most freshman safeties do in the SEC. But you know what? With a coaching addition like Will Harris, he could hopefully help these guys along. And maybe Jason Marshall will finally get the coaching he needs to live up to the 5-star hype that we all hoped he would, or a Jalen Kember, who was a French top 100 player at the University of Georgia in 2021. Maybe he decides that he wants to start making tackles instead of playing two-hand tag in the Florida-Georgia game. Will Harris, hopefully he's the difference maker. And Will Harris is somebody, and if you look at some of the clips that have come out, talks a lot about pad level tackling, which is something the secondary desperately needs. So, Neil, what are your thoughts on the Will Harris hire? And do you think Billy Napier graded? What do you think? How good of a hire was this by Billy Napier?
Okay, so a couple things I want to touch on real quick before I answer that question. Number one, I refuse to believe that the guy who literally earned LSU's entire reputation as DBU, guy who recruited and then developed guys like Eric Reed and Jamal Adams and Christian Fulton and Derek Stingley, that he just suddenly forgot how to coach. So when you say something like Jason Marshall finally gets the coaching he needs, like that's a okay kind of moment. But fine, maybe he just needs a different voice. Fair enough. Whatever. As for the so here, all right, the other thing I want to say is I think that for the past few weeks, I've definitely been getting a name for criticizing Billy Napier for pretty much everything under the sun. One thing I will say is I think he got this hire right, and that I don't think it's fair to really use the fact that he's currently with the Chargers as the headliner of his introduction, like because it's not the most relevant piece of information about him. Like it's always the most recent or current position someone holds when the press release gets drafted, tweet goes out, says XYZ hired by company ABC. Yeah, I know he's a current assistant with the Chargers. I feel like too many people are going to just read that sentence, Google Chargers defense, see the stats, and go, okay, well, he sucks, and not care to do any more research. But those people should know, Chris, as you touched on, he also served as the DB coach for the Washington Huskies from 2018 to 2021. And he was responsible for recruiting and then developing two really, really great defensive backs, Trent McDuffie and Kyler Gordon, and developed them into high NFL draft picks. McDuffie went in the first round. Gordon just missed the first round, went very early in round two, first couple of picks. I think it was like 38 or 39 overall in the draft. So two top 40 picks in the NFL draft. And that's just the beginning of his Washington resume. He's also worked with cornerback Elijah Molden, who was a late third round pick, cornerback Byron Murphy, first pick of the second round in his draft class, and safety Taylor Rapp, a late second round pick at different points of their college careers. So to me, the Chargers assistant is kind of a I don't want to say a misnomer, but it's not the most relevant tagline for him, because in his 4 years as the DB coach for the Washington Huskies, he did an excellent job. So I'm very, very happy with it. And again, for those of you who are on social media, follow me on Twitter, you know I've not been happy with Billy this offseason so far for a variety of different things, like not holding on to ETN, not hiring a defensive line coach, not showing any real urgency in the portal, pointing out each and every item on the laundry list of in-game failures he's been responsible for that may have led to some of these things happening, like not holding on to ETN or needing to go to the portal. I think he got this hire right. And I think that it's fair for those who are the most critical of him to also be willing to come out and say, hey, he did this one thing right. He's doing this right. And at least being open to seeing where it goes. Because I do think that there is some positive momentum that is going to be possibly built with Will Harris. I mean, he may have saved us with Filsami. We'll see, but he at least is making him think about it.
He did, like you mentioned, he did go visit Xavier Filsami as soon as he was hired. It was made public. He knew before it was made public to us. Billy Napier told him who his DB coach would be. So that's the argument of like, okay, because he fired Corey Raymond, that's why we're going to lose X. I don't think so. I think that, Billy Napier is telling people behind the scenes who the likely hires are at the DB coach, and I would speculate defensive line coach as well at this point. I don't think.
Well, if you want to say that though, you have to then come up with an explanation for why a JUCO kid literally told a Gators beat reporter, "Yeah, I canceled my visit because they don't have a defensive line coach." Was he lying? I mean, that's kind of what you're saying.
Well, at the time they don't have a defensive line coach, but also at the same time, I know who you're talking about. That JUCO kid has one offer, which outside of, and I don't even think he has a official Florida offer. So I'm not going to get totally up in arms about that right now.
Putting a pin in this, and we will come back to this conversation later in the show because this is previewing something that we will touch on.
Fair enough. But as far as Will Harris goes, I do agree. Right now, I would grade it as a B plus. I think it's a solid hire. I don't think it's a home run hire. It remains to be seen. But if he can come in, let's say he saves Xavier Filsami, and then he can maybe get Jason Marshall drafted next year if he decides to come back to Florida. If the secondary actually doesn't lose this game, then gets gashed for 500 plus yards against LSU and everybody else under the sun, then you know
700
what?
yards, not 500.
Yeah,
700.
I'm pretty much anybody and everybody. Arkansas, South Carolina, uh, Kentucky, almost 300 yards of rushing. Our DB is getting trucked by Ray Davis there. I mean, whoever it may be, if they look like they want to actually tackle and cover, then this turns into an A plus higher. But I would say right now at this point, I'd grade it as a B plus higher, and we'll see where things go as the offseason progresses.
B plus sounds fair. Honestly, I mean, look at me being the positive. And I'll give it an A minus because again, the Washington resume is tremendous. I know this Charger defense is not very good this year. NFL as an assistant defensive backs coach is far less relevant to what we're hiring him for compared to the Washington Huskies DB coach. That is the exact role we have him as now. So pass defense was great there. And I think that this is an A minus just because that is a Power 5 offer. I mean, it's a school. I mean, they weren't in it while he was there, but it's a school that has made the playoff now twice. So it's got a pedigree, and he stepped in there and he did everything he could and lived up to it. So I don't want to say that it's going to be as great as we said the Corey Raymond hire was, but it looks like a very good one. So A minus, and good job by Billy to realize that it's not always the most recent thing on your resume that's the most important.
Yeah. No, I agree. And I think that's the important thing about this hire. Assistant defensive back coach in the NFL. He's not the main guy calling the defense, nor is he the main coach actually coaching them on the sideline. So I think his college pedigree speaks for itself. So we'll see. I like it. B plus, A minus. I think that's a fair grade going in evaluating this hire. And we look to see hopefully soon if we do hire a replacement for Sean Spencer, because that has yet to be announced. And there have yet to be other staff changes that we are anticipating to be made. We'll see where that goes after early signing day. All right, Neil, let's get into the transfer portal news. And we're going to do a little segment here where it's going to be net positive, net negative, or neutral as we evaluate the 17 transfers out of the Florida Gators football program. Before today, we had 17 transfers out and 0 in, and that has changed today. We'll talk about that commitment that we did get, and it is a big commitment, by the way. So right now, the Gators are sitting at a net negative 16 players out of the program. Now, a lot of people, I think, are criticizing Napier for this, and they look at these numbers. Well, I think some people are being a little bit disingenuous with those numbers. I put out a tweet earlier on my personal handle at Mr. Chris Pitts, and I said, people sharing the graphic and not providing context are being disingenuous. We've only had 6 graduating scholarship players this season. So just to sign our current high school class, we needed this amount of attrition that we are seeing. The majority of guys transferring out too were not starters in 2023. And we'll talk about the guys that were starters. There are some doozies in here, but there are a lot of guys that did transfer out that needed to leave the program in order to bring in members of the upcoming high school class, which we'll talk about tonight. So just thought I'd throw that out there. Yes, this does not excuse the fact that it does seem like Billy and his staff have not had urgency in the portal coming off a 5-7 season. We'd like to see more urgency. We got our first commitment today, but we want to see a little bit more going forward. So Neil, let's go through the offense first, then we'll go through the defense. This is really quick. These are kind of quick hitters. Net positive, net negative, or neutral, evaluating it. So we're going to start with quarterback Max Brown, who did transfer out, valiantly played against the Missouri Tigers, almost won us that game and almost won us the FSU game, did decide to transfer out and has since committed to Charlotte. So a program that we faced this past year. I think that's a good opportunity, certainly for him. For me, I think this is a net neutral, where it's not a negative nor a positive. It frees up a scholarship spot, but that means we're likely going to go into next season probably with only 2 scholarship players in Graham Mertz and DJ Lagway. Jack Miller graduated this year. I don't anticipate him back. I wouldn't be surprised if he just left the game of football altogether. So Neil, I say net neutral on this one. What do you say for Max Brown?
Well, tricky. I would probably say a very, very, very small net negative, only because since the national championship season in 2008, starting in 2009, where Taylor Wyndham of Kentucky knocked out Tim Tebow, every single season since then, but one, Florida has had to go to its backup quarterback at least once, either due to injury or just sheer incompetence. So now, who is that going to be in 2024? Well, that would be a true freshman, and he might be very good, but he's still a true freshman. Max Brown was a veteran who'd been in the system, who'd been there before, and maybe, I don't know, maybe he would have had to come into play because Lagway just had the moment get too bright for him. So that could be a situation that plays itself out. So I'll say a net negative only for that. But if you were to tell me that quarterback issue, or that if you're telling me that Mertz doesn't get injured, I think I can say, okay, fine, net neutral.
Okay. Yeah. I mean, I think the only negative is the fact that we're not going to have three scholarship quarterbacks, but I think overall it's kind of a neutral, and we certainly wish him best of luck in Charlotte and thank him for what he did at UF. So let's go to running backs, and this is a big one. This is probably the worst one. Trevor Etienne. I think this is a resounding, massive net negative. You lose your best player arguably on the team. You lose your first big recruit in the 2022 class. And if the rumors are true, you're losing him to your biggest arch rival, the Georgia Bulldogs. So this is pretty big. And we're not gonna we're trying to get through all these quickly tonight, Neil, but I'm gonna give you
this one needs more time. It is a complete and utter catastrophe. If he goes to Georgia, it is a complete and utter catastrophe. It is a terrible thing if he goes to a non-rival, but it is an absolute disaster if you lose him to Georgia. People look, it is a coping mechanism. It is a lazy cop out to go running backs are a dime a dozen. You realize the shelf life of running back is 2 years in NFL anyway, or something half baked like that. The problem with that is that, yeah, that's true, but you have to have an elite offensive line for that to be true. Like, I don't know, all 32 NFL teams do, because the NFL, there's not really a real talent disparity between the different teams. So in college, if you were, say, Georgia, and you had a Trevor Etienne and you lost him, like he commits to Georgia to begin with and then leaves Georgia, yeah, you're right. It's not a big deal then, because you have an offensive line comprised of 5 stars that every other major school in the country wanted, and who were going to get picked very highly in the NFL draft. Not the case at Florida. So because ETN was the kind of running back who could kind of mask those offensive line issues, because he could break tackles, he could spin away, he could make you miss, he could lower his shoulder and just run you over at times too. He made it more so that Florida could get away with not having a great offensive line. Montreal Johnson's a very good running back because I think he has good vision. I wouldn't say great, but it's certainly good. He can break tackles. He can do some nice things. He's not the electric playmaker that ETN is. He's not even close. So you lost a guy, like, you don't have a good offensive line to start with. You lost the closest thing to your ability to cloak your offensive line's weakness. So now you better hit the jackpot in the portal on the offensive line if you're going to use that running back for a dime a dozen piece. Because then I would feel better about, Tran Webb, and if Cam Carroll decides to come back, and Montreal Johnson. But until then,
yeah.
No.
Well, and that's the thing. Cam Carroll's coming off an ACL, a pretty gruesome ACL. It wasn't just your regular tear. He tore multiple ligaments in that knee, and it's a mystery of whether or not he's even ready for fall camp. I mean, look what happened to Cam Rising. Guy didn't even play this year. So not all ACLs are the same, and certainly his was very severe. We'll see if he's able to return. Obviously, we're excited about Trayon Webb. I think he showed some flashes of greatness in the season, and I think right now, looking into it, he's probably a running back 2 going into next year. Kanan Daniels balled out at Mississippi, in the state of Mississippi, won a state title there. His numbers are crazy off the charts. Go check it out on 247 or one of the other sites. They've got him. I mean, he just padded the stats. But he's a freshman running back in the SEC, and it's not Trevor Etienne. So I think the biggest thing is it's a perception loss. The perception is you lost your best player when you truly needed him to come back. And
okay,
now,
but wait a minute.
And the other thing is the perception is he's not leaving even for NIL. He's leaving because you're not winning. Like, that is the reason. He's leaving because you are not winning, and he's got 1 year left before he goes to the pros, and he wants to win. So he's going to go to the program right now that is winning more than almost anybody else in college football, which is your rival. I mean, that is why it hurts. Now, there is some rumors too that he is potentially looking at returning home to the state of Louisiana and playing LSU and going for LSU. But once again, another rival you're going to face next year in the Swamp. So either way, you're going to face him on the field. And I just think right now, this is a perception loss that people are jumping ship from your program, and a guy who you brought in as somebody that supposedly bought in from day one. And yes, Neil, that's a good point on the offensive line, one that I had not thought of, because right now, yes, we did get a commitment on the offensive line today. That was big, a potential starter for next year. But there's still work to be done on the offensive line for it to improve. And a good running back like ETN who can break tackles at the line of scrimmage is somebody that certainly can mask that problem, especially also when you don't have a mobile quarterback like we do in Graham Mertz. So for me, this is a perception thing. I do think that Florida is bringing in some talent with Keenan Daniels, potentially a Jaden Ball who is looking at the University of Florida as well, but it is still a massive loss for
Okay, so
perception purposes.
all right, I'm gonna bring up this hypothetical then. All right, I don't know, you have a toss sweep, and it's to Montreal Johnson, and he's sprinting to the edge, doesn't have the breakaway speed. He's tackled for a 15-yard gain. Trevor Etienne would have had the speed to make it a 75-yard touchdown. Is it a perception loss then?
No, I mean it's a talent loss too, Neil, but I think it's a bigger perception issue that
Okay.
Napier is having to fight because he's lost his best player to the portal and to a rival. And the primary reason isn't NIL, which everybody talks about now. I'm sure he's getting a great NIL deal wherever he goes, but it's
He
because
is.
we're not winning. Like Florida would have gladly given
Okay,
him
so
a solid NIL deal. It's that we're not winning, and it's a
that's what
perception problem.
you meant, Piper. Okay, fine.
Yeah. Yeah, that's what I mean. It's a perception.
I thought you meant from like an issue of, well, our fan base just likes to bitch about anything. So the
Oh
perception.
no, no,
Okay,
not at all.
okay,
No,
fair enough. Fair enough.
this is a
Fair enough.
perception. I just think that everybody sees that Florida right now is a sinking ship. They have a lame duck coach who might get fired next season, and your best player's jumping ship. So I think it's a perception issue.
Okay.
Um, but one that Florida is going to have to continuously fight now to get back in the portal. All right. I don't know if we'll have to go in depth as much for any other player now. We're
Well,
going to
maybe
move on to
not.
wide receivers, where we've had two guys transfer out. I'll start with Ty Bowman, a guy that was a JUCO player who transferred into Florida in Billy Napier's first year. I would say this is probably a net positive, and no disrespect to Ty Bowman, I just don't think he ever was of the caliber of a player or an athlete that should play at the University of Florida if we want to be an elite football program. And I think it frees up a scholarship to bring in. I certainly think you could look at any of the high school talents we're bringing in this coming season and then the guys that we brought in last year and Eugene Wilson, Andy Jean, Aiden Mizell, all of them probably are better than Ty Bowman. So for me, this is a net positive.
I think it's hard to say that any one departure is a net positive without seeing the replacement that you bring in for him. You say it frees up a scholarship spot. Well, if we bring in another guy in the portal who never amounts to any statistical production, then is it really a positive? So it's a
Well,
positive if you do the right thing with it.
well,
But
the guy you're bringing in is Jeray Hawkins. The guy you're bringing in is
all
Tawaski
right,
Abrams. The
fine.
guy you're bringing in
That's
is
fair.
Isaiah Williams. Because right now, like I mentioned at the top, Florida only has 6 guys graduating. You had to have this attrition in order to make room for those guys. So that is who you're bringing in. You're bringing in talented freshman 4-star wide receivers, and it would be nice to top it off with a uh, portal receiver, which we
That's
are
what I'm getting
looking
at.
at some. But I think you are replacing him with that. So
Yeah.
just to be clear,
Which is still like an investment into the future. And I don't know how ready they'll be in 2024. For example, I was very high and still am very high on Aiden Mizell, but his body wasn't ready in 2023. We thought he was going to be a drop in, set and forget receiver in the Florida offense, and it just didn't happen. He needed to bulk up enough to be able to withstand some of the punishment, and I still think he can. He's a freshman, got a lot of time still, but didn't materialize right away. So as far as the 2024 season goes, I don't know that replacing him with a bunch of true freshmen is a net positive. Then he didn't really play. So All right, I'll go with you and say net positive on this one. But
Okay.
I just think that there has to be that caveat there that the freshman receivers we bring in need to pan out. They need to
Hmm.
live up to their billing.
For sure. All right. Caleb Douglas is the other receiver committed to Texas Texans. And so this was a return home for him. Unfortunately, had an injury in the Kentucky game. That was the last time we ever saw him in a Gator uniform. I'm going to say this is a net negative because, Douglas was a starter until the injury, was that guy known for going up, making those high flying catches, those kind of a possession receiver, something I think now we sort of lack in the offense, unless you have a Gene or a Mizell step up this season, or you bring in a portal receiver. So for me, until we kind of know who's going to replace that, I would say it's a net negative. Not as big as ETN, but still a negative.
It's a negative. I don't think it's a terrible one. Again, because of the conversation we just had on Ty Bowman. But with that caveat still in place, the Jerry Hawkins, the TJ Abrams have to pan out. But we do have more room now for another portal receiver. But I don't think you're gonna have anyone hit the way that he did. I mean, I flew down to Aggieland for that game at Texas A&M. That box out catch he made in the end zone against Texas A&M was among the most impressive things I've seen from a Florida receiver. Like that, he got held early in that play, overcomes that to find himself find himself through the defense and get open in the end zone enough for the ball to get thrown to him in the first place. And then
And
as the
I'm
ball's in midair.
Neil, I'm actually sorry to interrupt. We actually have breaking news on the show. The
Oh,
Florida Gators have landed defensive lineman Joey Slackman from Penn. Joey Slackman now has committed to the Gators. He had visited Florida last week, was offered by multiple SEC schools this past week, but has now decided to go with the Gators. So the Gators have landed not one, two portal additions. So this is live breaking news here on December 17th. We are bringing it to you on this show. So, all right. Maybe
fight
things are
on
starting to look
for
up a little bit.
Penn. I mean, my dad's
All
a Penn
right.
alumni. I always root for Penn in the Ivy League. So I actually obviously don't follow them anywhere close to as much as I follow Florida. But I mean, I saw him live twice, once against Columbia, once against Dartmouth. I liked what I saw from him. I mean, he did stick out like in that game among other Ivy League athletes. I didn't, from watching him in those two games, I didn't think that he was an NFL prospect, but I thought that he definitely popped off. He definitely looked better than the rest of the athletes on that field. So
Mhm.
I mean, maybe in the Florida program, he'll take that explosive step and become something tremendous. Maybe he just is a very good defensive line. Like maybe he's a Jabari Zuniga level defensive end for us, but that's a nice pickup for Florida.
Look, I mean, he's the 25th overall player currently in the 247 sports transfer rankings, the number 3 overall defensive lineman, 6'4", 300 pounds, sported offers from places like Texas A&M, Auburn, Missouri, Miami, Wisconsin, Colorado, who's currently very hot on the transfer portal. I mean, this is a big win and something that I think really sticks out to, and this is always, I thought, why he was a fit at Florida. He said the brand of the Gators is unlike a lot of other places. He said following the visit, the coaches did a really good job explaining the plan they had moving forward to turn this thing around and where they see me fitting in their defenses and being a part of this thing. And I think obviously UPenn, an Ivy League school, University of Florida, a top 5 public institution, it's a great fit. It's a solid fit. He's got 1 year of eligibility left, and we have a massive need at the defensive line, which we have not yet talked about. Those portal, there's certainly one portal subtraction there that has hurt us. But Joey Slackman here live on the air has committed to the Florida Gators. So big get for there, and I think that that'll cover our analysis of him. I'm sure Neil will be dropping an article, and we'll be dropping some more information on him after the show here on our social media account. But Gators now 2 portal additions after having none. So that takes us now to net negative 15 through the portal. And we move on from wide receivers, as we just covered Caleb Douglas and Ty Bowman. Move to tight ends. Jonathan Odom, who is now since graduated from University of Florida, a Gator legacy, and has committed to Eastern Michigan to play his last 2 years of college football. And Andrew Savanea, who was a defensive lineman, and was moved to tight end, never really saw the field whatsoever. Jonathan Odom did play some meaningful snaps, but it was pretty obvious, Neil, in the middle of this past season, fell behind Arliss Boardingham, fell behind Hayden Hansen. And I think in Keon Zipper comes back from his ACL, probably is behind him as well. So I don't think that this is, to me, I'll say it's a net positive in the sense that the tight end room was clogged. We had 7 scholarship tight ends going into the season. That is way too many tight ends. And I know Billy Napier loves his 12 personnel, but even then, that's still way too many tight ends
Yeah.
when you be reallocating those scholarships in different areas. So for me, both of these are net positives.
Yeah, 7A probably. Again, keep it respectful, keep it real. It does free up a scholarship spot for someone more able to produce good game tape. I think that is probably the nicest way to put that. Odom is a little tougher because he did produce on the field. He did make plays in the game for the Florida Gators, not just as a pass catcher, but he did lay some, he did lay some pretty nasty blocks every now and then. And he had one pancake, I think, against FSU where the guy was like kind of reeling, but then he regained his footing for a second, and then he just finished him off last year in 22 in Tallahassee. That was so. I mean, he could play, but I'll say net neutral just because that feels like a loss where the tight end room is clogged, but if it wasn't, he could play and he could play at a fairly respectable level.
Yeah, no. Well, overall, I think we get that tight end. I think the tight end room sort of solidified itself. Arliss Boardingham, Hayden Hansen as the guys in the future. Keon Zipper has not decided his future. He did graduate. Hopefully, he comes back from his ACL one way or another, whether that is playing here at the University of Florida or somewhere else. But certainly a talent, of a high 4-star talent when he came out of college or high school in the 2019 class. And then, of course, Tony Livingston. Tony Livingston, a tight end from the Tampa area who didn't play this past year, somebody that the coaching staff was very high on due to his athletic ability. Offensive line, this will just round out the offensive transfers. 2 guys that brought in by the Billy Napier regime, but 2 guys that did not quite crack the starting lineup in their first 2 years at Florida. Those were one Jordan Herman and Jalen Farmer, both played in reserve roles, have now moved on to the transfer portal, have not found homes since then. Overall, I'm gonna say net positive for both too, Neil. And the reason I say that is because I'm not 100% convinced that either one was really going to move the needle and getting the offensive line to the elite level that they need to be at. So, and it becomes a true positive if you replace them with a guy like Florida transfer Brandon Crenshaw Dixon from San Diego State, who visited Florida this past week and committed to the Gators. He had visited TCU, Louisville, and Virginia Tech. Florida, though, had zeroed in on him as their main target to play at the offensive tackle position and committed to Florida off his visit. Big get for the staff. This is a guy who 6'6", 310 pounds, has started the last 3 seasons at San Diego State. And Neil, he's not just a tackle that can play one side. He has played both sides, the left and the right side, has only given up, I believe, 6 sacks in his entire career with the Aztec. And yes, that's Mountain West football. That is not SEC football, but still limits the amount of pressures that he's given up to quarterbacks, has proven that he can play both sides, which allows Billy Napier and his staff to have flexibility on the offensive line. And what this means, if he starts, it means you could start him at one side of the tackle position and then put Austin Barber where he's more comfortable on the tackle spot, which is typically the left side. So you put Brandon on the right and then Austin Barber on the left. Then that's when you can start playing guys on the interior at their more natural position. And that is when Damon George, who played tackle all this year, but naturally is more of a guard and might have an opportunity at the very least to now give us some depth on that interior side of the ball. So a massive get there when you replace a guy like Jordan Herman, who was a reserve tackle, and replace him with Brandon Crenshaw Dixon. To me, net positive.
Yeah, I mean, pretty much agree with all that. I do think that a lot of people may get the sense that, well, offensive linemen are offensive linemen. They can just play anywhere. Like, I don't know. You say he's a tackle, but he could probably play center. I don't know. He seems like a guard, but I don't know. He could probably play tackle. Typically not the case without experiencing some kind of drop off in production. I mean, we saw Damian George he looked foolish, for lack of a better way to put it. And I understand that he's more of a natural guard, but like, there's no way that Nick Saban would have ever wanted him in the first place if he thought that he was going to look anything like that at his more natural position. So I think there's some validity to that, and that needs to be seconded on my end. Pretty much agree that, I mean, San Diego State, obviously not a Power 5 or an SEC school, but I think that Brandon put enough good things on tape, at least from what the scouts seem to say about him, that he's put himself in the conversation to one day have a shot at an NFL roster. And, well, and could be another Osiris Torrance in the sense that he uses Florida as that stepping stone to get himself up into the first round. So probably not that kind of ceiling for him, but definitely could use Florida as an opportunity to bolster his status.
Yep. Agreed. All right. Well, that gets us through the offensive transfers. Now let's move to the defensive side of the ball. We'll start on the defensive line, where we did get two guys that were former 4-stars commits to Billy Napier. Chris McCullen, Will Norman have left the program, have not found new homes since then. And I think overall, McClellan is the big loss. Now, I guess now his official replacement has come into the program, and that is one Joey Slackman, who we just talked about. But Chris McClellan has SEC experience now, 2 years, was in and out of the rotation. So to me, this is a net negative overall. Still, bringing in Slackman lessens the blow now. And let's say if you bring in a guy like an LT Overton, who's still out there, the Texas A&M transfer, former 5-star player there, who has visited Alabama, the coaching staff is trying to get him on campus as well. Then I think it's a wipeout at that point. But right now, I think it's still a net negative in the department of Chris McClellan. Will Norman, I would say it's neutral. And the reason I say that is just because didn't crack the rotation in his freshman year. A lot of freshmen played this past year. He was not one of them from the 2023 class. So I would say right there, neutral. But if he goes somewhere else and balls out, then that's a different story. But looking at the list of teams that are interested in Norman right now, not a lot of Power 5 offers. So I think that is a little bit telling right there. Keenan Landry was a transfer into the JUCO ranks, and he was a preferred walk-on, and then if he got a scholarship, I think right there that's kind of a positive, because if you then are replacing Landry with the Slackman, that's an upgrade. So you kind of see how we're kind of starting to play with this a little bit. But overall, I would say this is for the 3 defensive line guys. I'm going to categorize them as all 3. McClellan, negative. Landry, a positive. Norman, neutral.
So we're going to give Princely his own category. Okay.
Yeah, I'm putting him in the edge department.
Okay.
Sorry.
Okay. I mean, that is kind of defensive line, but I mean, okay. 6 one half dozen the other. Fine. Yeah, McClellan hurts. First, there's just the awesomeness factor that he committed to the Gators when they had absolutely no coach. Like, it was right after Mullen got fired, and there was no, and I guess there was some smoke that Napier was coming in, but there was nothing really concrete. He committed to Florida right then and there anyway. So like it was so soon after Mullen got fired that it came from Lee Davis Begley's account. Like, we got to commit, let's go. So like, that's pretty cool. That's one of those guys that just absolutely loves being a Gator, doesn't care who the coach is. So it hurts from that standpoint. And then it hurts from the standpoint of he did produce for the Gators. I mean, he was in there as a true freshman, not on every play, but frequently enough. And he was making tackles. I mean, his name was mentioned by the PA announcer more than once per game. So, a lot of good things he put on tape. Obviously, the consistency, not really there. If it was, he would have played a lot more snaps than he did. But definitely stings, because that was a guy who you could count on at the very least to step in and make some plays when your starters got tired or if there were injuries there. So it's obviously not going to use the words like catastrophic like I use for ETN, but this one does sting a bit. The others I'll say are neutral. I mean, Norman had promised, but again, I mean, he came in as part of a class that had 5 defensive line signees, and actually had 6, but we lost one on sign day to UCF because there were so many of them. So kind of figured one of them was going to happen. Sucks to lose anyone who's that talented, but when you sign 5 guys at any one position, you kind of have to see that coming.
Yeah. Yeah. Agreed. All right. So now we'll get into Princey and Manilin. I think we all know where this is. This is probably almost on par with ETN as a major net negative. And that's a lot of people believe Princely was on his way out the door. I think people believed he was going to go to the NFL. So not only is he not going to the NFL, but now he's transferring to Ole Miss, the hottest transfer portal team in the country. Lane Kiffin is assembling an incredible roster to make a run next season, one of which will be playing the Gators a week before the season ends next year in the Swamp. So Princely's not going to him and not choosing to not play his last year in college football to get developed by Florida. Now, could they defensive line coaching change have played a factor? Potentially. Potentially. But of course, Mike Peterson is his coach too, as he plays more of that edge offense outside linebacker role. Neil, I still think it's a major negative just because of the fact that he is choosing to go to another SEC foe who's going to play us. And once again, you're fighting the perception problem that he did not want to get developed by you in his last year of his college career.
Let's see how effectively Princely can set the edge at Ole Miss. That will determine exactly what this is going to get labeled as, because I mean, he could make things happen in the backfield. He could be very disruptive, very problematic off that edge, but he could also just not be in the right place at the right time. There was some game tape of him lagging and kind of just lollygagging first in the Vegas Bowl against Oregon State, which you could say, okay, well, blowout. It's a meaningless spring game now. So, okay, whatever. Then it happens again against Utah. And it just, again, not every play, but he would take plays off where you can see he's clearly not running with 100% effort. And like, okay, I get it. You're in a position that I could never be in. You're an SEC athlete, and I can't talk badly about, what you're doing or not doing because I couldn't do what you do, but it's not really enjoyable to see someone on scholarship at the University of Florida not giving every ounce of physical energy they possibly can. So I don't know. But now remember who Ole Miss's strength and conditioning coach is. Do you want to remind everyone?
Nick Savage.
Yeah. Who, for all we want to say about Dan Mullen, he did a pretty damn good job. So he might have just, he might have made a mood for his future. And that's, to your perception point, that really stinks. So again, it's a rung or two beneath ETN, but it's a pretty bad loss.
Yeah. Yeah, no, I think so too. And I think it's just mainly, like I said, because he did not want to get developed in his final year college career at Florida. And that's a very good point on Savage too. One that I had not thought of yet. Final position group. We're going to skip over the rest of the linebacker core because there have been no departures there, nor have there been departures in the cornerback room. However, there has been some movement in the safety room, and that are Jadarius Perkins, Kamari Wilson, and Miguel Mitchell. Jadarius Perkins left the team much earlier in the season. Kamari Wilson, who was not on a depth chart past week 4, no surprise there. And Miguel Mitchell, I think he was thrown into the portal by Luther Burden in the Missouri game earlier this past season. But all 3 now are in the portal. Kamari Wilson has since committed to Arizona State. Jadarius Perkins has taken a visit to UCF. Still waiting to see what he decides to do for his final year in his college career. But the Gators now are down 3 safeties in that room. Overall, though, Neil, I'm going to say these are all net positives. And the reason I say that is because it was pretty abundantly clear Miguel Mitchell was not the safety we thought he was. Kamari Wilson pretty much became a cancer to the team. And Jadarius Perkins, a lot of issues personally off the field. I know you know him pretty well, but I think overall, just guys that were not contributing in a positive way in the locker room and not doing much on the field when they were on it. So, and I think Perkins out of the 3, actually, you could argue was the best performer. But played more of that
pick in 2022. Yeah.
Right. But it played more of that nickel role, which has been superseded by Sharif Denson now. So I would say overall it's a positive, especially if you're able to remake that safety room, especially if you're able to hang on to a guy like Xavier Filsami, especially if you're able maybe to get a Xavier Mency. This thing could really look up. And the safety room is upgraded. And I also think those are guys that were all passed over by Jordan Castell and Bryce Thornton last year. And if you bring in another safety or two in the transfer portal, which Florida is currently looking at, then it is a net positive for Florida.
Yeah.
So I think right now that's where I'm leaning on this.
I would say Perkins is a net negative if he had lasted more than just a couple games, because he could produce for Florida, and he did. But Florida also went most of the season, the overwhelming majority of the season, without him. So you're not really losing something that you don't have in the first place. But if you want to talk about like from 2022 to 2024, like that 2-year jump, yeah, we did lose something because he could make incredible plays. I don't know, man. It's hard to remove like the personal connection I have with him, because I know him very well personally with the Gator piece of this, but there's just an attitude about him that was like he could have 9 great plays and he could have one bad play, and the one bad play would be pissing him off all day, all night, and he would just ruin his mood. Like, for example, Missouri game 2022, we beat them 24-17. He has a pretty good overall game that day, but he misses one tackle late, and that was our Gator Good Foundation game too. So and that year we had a couple kids. It wasn't even for the first time we brought kids who were under 18. So like they were younger kids who were younger than the players. So there are guys that look up to him, and they meet him after the game. And the first thing he goes, he just shakes his head. He's like, "Do you believe I missed that tackle? Do you believe I missed that freaking tackle? That was trash." But like Jadarius is saying this to the kids, it's like, that was trash, man. That play was trash. Like there's a level of accountability he holds himself to for the few mistakes he makes on the field, when most of his game tape is good. Like, it's one thing if most of your game tape is bad. Like Miguel Mitchell, okay, wish him the best, nothing personal. Probably a net positive there. But Jadarius Perkins did a lot of positive things on the field, and the negative things that he did were what fueled him and ate at him. And you can say that, well, maybe he shouldn't be perseverating to that degree. Maybe he should learn to, take it with a grain of salt and say, okay, I got to work on this, but not let it poison his mood the rest of his week. But okay, there was someone who held himself accountable and wanted to do great. So in that sense, that's a negative, because I think that Florida is lacking that in massive quantities with this current team. And Kamari Wilson is the other one. Yeah, I mean, that's just disappointing, because I mean, we all had high hopes for him when we flipped him from Georgia late on in 2022 cycle, but I mean, the fact that he wasn't with the roster, couldn't make the travel roster. Some chatter about the weight he gained. Well, did he want to be a linebacker? Did he want to be a defensive back? Whatever. He didn't play for the Florida Gators, so there was a lot of expectations there. They didn't pan out. Disappointing. But from what he produced on the field to what we could potentially have, I think is probably a net positive, unfortunately.
All right, Neil. So that covers all of the portal guys out. We've had, like I said, 17 transfer out. Now, as of this hour, 2 have transferred in for a net loss of 15. But as we mentioned at the top, that attrition had to take place. A lot of it had to take place in order for this roster to, turn over the new high school recruits that we have coming in. But there still persists this notion that Florida has had lack of activity, where you've seen a team like Ole Miss just raid the portal, raid it. You've had other programs like LSU add. You've had other programs like A&M start to even add. You've had Deion Sanders literally transform his offensive line room with 6 portal additions and the addition of Jordan Seaton, who once a thought to be a Florida prospect that was leaning our way. So there was a lack of activity between the loss to Florida State, the time we fired the coaches, and to tonight, where we got 2 commitments in a day, 3 days before National Signing Day. I mean, I think we're starting to see movement now, Neil, but I think it just goes to the whole thing that there just wasn't the urgency from this coaching staff that has led to the point of frustration. But I think, going into the show tonight, I think we were all like, okay, we're going to blast the staff here for having moved. Now we've got two solid ones, two guys that we really did need and are going to contribute. These are day one contributors coming into the program next year. So let's not get it twisted. These are good additions. But overall, how concerned are you still about what Billy Napier needs to do in order to get a roster that's good enough to win more than 7 games next year?
I mean, yeah, they are two good additions. The problem is that it's still a massive net negative when you talk about Trevor Etienne, talk about Caleb Douglas, you talk about Chris McClellan, you talk about Princely Lemon, losing all those guys. Oh, and the guys who, I mean, not your fault, but you are losing Ricky Pearsall. Mm-hmm. So you're losing a lot of pieces from this past team. And for the first couple of days, the first couple of weeks, there really wasn't much movement. So I was frustrated. You were frustrated. And I think that I'll be able to answer the question of like where I stand with the current roster, what I think about it when we hit January or February and we filled out our roster, because Napier does move slowly. Let's just put that out there. It's pretty clear that he doesn't move with any urgency. Not necessarily a terrible thing. Sometimes these relationships do need to be slow cooked in order for him to land them. So, okay, possible. But here's what I'm going to say. To everyone that goes, trust the process. See, we got Slackman. See, we got the San Diego State kid. Just trust the process. You don't know everything that's going on. Here's a response. All right. First thing is Chris and I know more than those people who say that probably think. We just don't say every single thing that we hear on Twitter, because sometimes you do need to keep things to yourself, which we do. So that's the first thing. That's beside the point. I do have an ego, so this is a little tough for me to say, but for the most part, that criticism is fair. It's tough for me to say this, but I certainly don't know every single thing that Billy Napier does. I know some things, obviously. Definitely correct that I do not know every single thing that happens. So I'll admit that's fair. However, Billy Napier has not given me objective reasons to trust his process, because after the 2022 season, I said this over and over and over again on the show. Go back and watch it. Or, well, we didn't have live video then, but it's on Apple Podcasts. So go on Apple Podcasts, go scroll through back to our 2022 episodes and listen to the audio. Said this over and over and over and over and over again. Billy needed to hire an offensive coordinator, and he needed to hire a special teams coordinator for the 2023 season. I wasn't even that mad with the 2 offensive line coach system then, because we had an All-American in Cybo and a second team All-SEC guy in Ethan White. So there wasn't really much to criticize there. But anyway, must have been 20 to 30 times that I said, literally maybe 40, where I said, Billy, you got to hire an OC, dude. You got to hire a special teams coach, dude. I don't care that we beat South Carolina by 32 points. That might have been the single worst special teams game in 50 years for Gator football, maybe in history. In case anyone doesn't remember, Xavier Henderson fumbled a punt. Thankfully, we recovered it. We got beaten for a fake punt touchdown. After we called a timeout before the punt, we had 1 field goal blocked. We had another attempted field goal where we couldn't put the ball down properly. We gave up a 37-yard punt return to Josh Vann and then committed a needless face mask penalty at the end of it. Very next week, Jason Marshall fumbles a punt in the end zone. The Cardinals sent a punt returning. That was that. End of conversation. That should have been all Billy needed to make changes there, and he didn't do it. Same for his in-game decision-making. I mean, that's probably the topic for discussion for a different day, but just to name a couple of things, from burning the timeout in the end game against Utah in the first game he coached, going for it in your own territory multiple times on 4th and 4, and then a 4th and 6, when you still had all your timeouts in the fourth quarter and your defense was doing well against Kentucky. The end of the first half play calling against LSU, all the way to abandoning your effective running game against FSU and making Richardson throw 3 straight times on 2 straight drives, all of which, by the way, were incomplete. I said, look, you need an OC. You need to do these 2 things. This is my attitude after 2022. There were some positives that year for sure, but these two things you have to do for 2023. He didn't do it. So as I said, as the season drew near, I said, okay, Billy, you can do what you want. You're the head coach. You can run the program how you see fit. But if things continue on the same trajectory and these same issues keep plaguing us and keep leading to losses on the field, it's going to be really hard to keep defending you. So I'm trusting you, but let's see how this plays out. Well, what happens? Play calling killed us against FSU. Special teams killed us against Utah. So no, I don't really trust his process because I think his lack of urgency has cost Florida at least 2 games this season. And, if he does more things throughout the course of the offseason that give me reason to change this lack of trust, then so be it. But we don't have that data right now.
That's a fair point. We don't have the data right now, but I do believe that we should be at least a little relieved that there's been some movement. And I think the next big data point is how this recruiting class finishes. I think that they have had to play a lot of defense in the last month on this class. We noted the attrition that it unfortunately experienced with losing a guy like Jamonte Waller, losing a guy like Wardell Mack. We did lose Kendall Jackson to Miami this past month. That one I don't think is as big of a deal. I think that was more of a schematic fit with Austin Armstrong. And that's another story to be talked about here, is the fact that Austin Armstrong is now, I think a lot of those defensive changes to the coaching staff and the recruiting have a lot to do with the scheme that Austin Armstrong wants to run, that we can be fully comfortable with the play calling next year. But, we've been bleeding some guys, and right now Florida is having to hang on to certain commitments. Now, Neil, if you look overall at the 2024 recruiting class right now, we still sit in the top 5 according to 247 and On3, but that's just at the moment. Right now, we're fighting to hold off on guys like Ardarius Hayes, who took a visit to Miami this past weekend. He's going to make a final decision on Wednesday. Amarius Williams, who has been flirting with pretty much every other school under the sun. I honestly don't even know how this guy's a commitment anymore, but tweeted out War Damn Eagle to multiple fans today. So there's that. He's retweeting random fan accounts saying, come be an Auburn Tiger. So we'll see there. He's coming off an Auburn Tiger visit this past weekend. Coaching staff did visit him this past weekend, North Carolina. We'll see if that's enough to hold on. He's a big part of the class, though. And then there's also guys like an LJ McCray who have said that countless times. I do believe he has shut this recruitment down finally, but Florida State made a big play for him late. And, and then Isaiah Williams also made a visit to Texas A&M, although reports are that he did call the coaching staff after the visit and has reassured them that he is going to stick with his commitment to the Gators. So almost every single guy right now in the class is solid outside of Xavier Folsami, who we've talked about, Amarius Williams, and potentially Ardarius Hayes. Now, right now, Florida sits at 282.89 in the 247 composite. That's with the addition of actually, that's with the transfer. So if you take him out, we're at 281. If you take out Amarius Williams, Ardarius Hayes, and Xavier Folsami, we're at 255.06. Now that's getting back into the Dan Mullen territory. So this is what's riding on this week if this coaching staff is not able to hold on to these guys. The class basically dissolves. If you hold on to them and then you add in a guy like a running back, like a Jaden Ball, who visited last week, visited Alabama this week. If you bring in a Gregory Smith III, we didn't talk about him when we talked about the safeties, but the coaching staff is very high on his ceiling. It's 6'4", 200-pound kid who was an athlete, can play both sides of the ball, but projects to play safety. A lot of crystal ball picks coming at him to join the Gators class. He's that fringe 3-4 star type of player. If you add in a Zay Mincy, who's going to silently commit on National Signing Day here this week, and then reveal that at the All-American game in January, then this class is solidly a top 5 class. It's a class that we all said Billy Napier had to sign this year. It's got big pieces on the defensive line with guys like LJ McCray. It solves your linebacker room issues with the additions of Aaron Childs, Ardarius Hayes, Miles Graham. You have your crown jewel in DJ Lagway. You have some speedy wide receivers to enter that room. And you've signed 2 running backs. The only area where we would need help, really, I would say, is probably some interior defensive line help, which enter Joey Slackman. Offensive line help, enter Brandon Crenshaw Dixon. We've already got Fletcher Westfall, who 4-star offensive lineman there. Hope to see him kind of build into that role, hopefully within a year or two of entering the program. But Neil, this week we have to watch for what happens, because if you lose X, if you lose Amaris Williams, if you lose Audarius Hayes, guys that have been long committed in the class, that have been the cornerstones of this class now for months, then this all really falls apart on Napier, and he is going to have to get some major wins in the transfer portal.
Yeah. Well, I mean, I do think that one win that we desperately need somewhere is on the offensive line. I think a lot of people thought that we were leading for Seaton. I don't think anyone ever thought that we really had him, but we were in a good position with Jordan Seaton. Well, if suddenly Michael Tarquin decides to fly back across the country and become a Gator, he's not a 5-star. He's not a guy you'd say is going to be like a Cybo. He's not even that kind of lineman, but he's not a first-round draft pick. But we saw him play for the Florida Gators, and he was certainly an adequate SEC-level offensive lineman. So, I mean, adequate is a big step up from what we saw from Damian George at one of those tackle spots last year. So that's an upgrade there. So that's something that I can say, okay, momentum, building positively. But if you lose two of those three guys that we just talked about, Audarius Hayes, Xavier Filsame, and Amaris Williams, you lose two of them. And again, we talk the same way we talk about stacking wins like early in the schedule. We've also talked about in the past about stacking elite talent, and not necessarily even just going for position by position, but just stockpiling elite talent at every position possible and just playing it out. You lose the ability to say that we did that. And that was the whole thing about having the bad 2023 season. Well, okay, 5-7 is pretty bad. We're all very, very, very displeased with this. However, he has an elite recruiting class coming in, so the future is bright. You lose two of those three guys, and you just can't say that. You lose any one of them in isolation, you can say, all right, well, we will have kept one of those elite defensive players if you lose one of them, or two of them, I should say. But I mean, it's just we're talking about building momentum for the offseason and for 2024, and there just becomes a additional level of difficulty in defending Napier at that point, because recruiting was supposed to be what was saving him.
I agreed. One thing too, we didn't touch on it. We did get a commitment last week from JUCO, an edge player, Brian Taylor.
Yeah.
Big Gator. I mean, this is a consensus top 20 JUCO guy according to On3247, ESPN, and even Rivals. Rivals has him ranked as the 4th highest JUCO player in the country, something Rivals didn't want right for once. But he was getting looks at top SEC schools. Auburn, Georgia, Tennessee, all had offered him. I know Auburn and Tennessee definitely wanted him, visited those schools. Opted for the Gators. Gators got him on campus last weekend and committed. So that is a good get for us, and at least, lessens the hard blow that is losing a Princely Umanyalan, who, Brian Taylor is an edge player, and he's going to take on that role. And of course, you get a guy back like a Justice Boone, who you hope will also come back from his ACL injury. His was not as severe as Cam Carroll's was, but that is a guy you would hope picks up where he left off and has the season next year that he was supposed to have this year. So their hope is not lost at that position. You also bring in a guy like LJ McCray. You've got a guy like Kelby Collins, who got some freshman, all conference, all American looks. Also TJ Searcy, who showed a lot of flashes. So I think the edge at least is one where you could sort of absorb these blows. Running back remains to be seen, because Cam Carroll, like we said, we don't know if he's coming back. We don't know what Trey on Webb ceiling is yet. We think it's good. We don't know if it's a great or elite like an Etienne's is. And then Montreal's a solid running back, probably poised now to maybe get 1,000 yards next year with that subtraction of Etienne. But that home run ability is lost. So I think that might be the biggest one. But Neil, I think that kind of sums this all up tonight. And I think it was a good catch up of where we are with the Gator football program 3 days before early signing day, really the new national signing day. We'll be coming back after that to give our reaction to what does transpire on Wednesday and our thoughts of where the roster sits. And we'll do a deep dive into the recruiting class and who could potentially make an impact early on next year. But I don't know, any final words, and then we'll wrap it up.
And like I was saying earlier, I want Napier to succeed. Everyone telling me to trust the process. I want to. There's just not the evidence out there that tells me that that's objectively the wise thing to do. He doesn't, like, when you go 11-14, like, it's as simple as this. When you go 11-14, you don't have the right to demand that of anyone. So no, I don't trust the process, frankly, because doing that has resulted in back-to-back losing seasons, and really starting with Mullen's tenure, which wasn't Napier's fault, but it's resulted in the worst 2-year stretch to the start of any Gator coach's career since 1979 and 1980. And in that case, there was a monster jump from year 1 to year 2. So I'm hoping and praying that things do get better for the Gators, but we'll just have to see. I'll leave it at that.
We saw some minor wins today. We'll see if we can get some major wins on signing day.
And was nice.
And we'll progress from there. Absolutely. Well, thank you all again for tuning in tonight to another episode of the All Kinds Weather Forecast. If you have not already, make sure to like down below, hit subscribe, let you know when we have a new episode. Leave a comment. Give your reaction to what you think these two new commitments tonight of Slackman and Brandon Crenshaw Dixon can do for the Gators next season. And if you're listening on audio formats, please rate and review the show so we can reach all of Gator Nation. So from all of us here at the All Kinds Weather Forecast, we thank you all again for tuning in. Go Gators. Let's keep the faith.